Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to talk about life on a chaos-controlled planet, or more specifically, what it's like to just be a regular citizen on a world owned by the ruinous powers. And we will primarily be talking about worlds ruled by other Chaos Cultists, or Chaos Space Marines at worst, because, well, demon worlds in the Eye of Terror? Whilst there are worlds in the Eye of Terror that possess human populations, they're not so much living on them as briefly existing, until they are caught and brutally murdered to death by some horned monster. At the absolute best, the life for a human in the Eye of Terror would be as a slave. At least then you would have the protection of being property. And hopefully, whatever force owns you is able and willing to protect you at least up until the point where you remain useful. Slaving away in the salt mines. Hey, you're gonna die there too from exhaustion or being whipped to death by brutal overlords, but your odds of survival are still significantly higher than out in the wild, where you're probably just going to be used for sport or ritual material. Now, there are some sort of kind of cushier jobs, like providing food for some of the more civilized Chaos worlds, like Medrengard, for example, which is owned and run by a Petarabo, where hundreds of Chaos Iron Warrior warbands each build their very own fortress and then engage in games of aggressive Minecraft with one another, sieging that fortress before falling back to defend their own, and so on. But again, for the overwhelming majority of the time, living on a demon world isn't really living at all. Hey, you might actually get lucky and get Nurgle. At least that way you'll slowly die of a disease rather than being torn apart by a demon vulture. So we'll mostly skip over the demon world segment and get to what it's like living on a world in real space, as, of course, Chaos owns and operates entire independent empires of their own. Nothing to rival the sheer scope and scale of the Imperium of Man, of course, but still significant holdings, often numbering dozens upon dozens of worlds and solar systems. We covered, of course, a major Chaos Empire in the War for the Sabbat Worlds series, where the forces of the Imperium were opposed by the Blood Pact, and preceding that as well, a series of Chaos Warlords that ruled over the Sanguinary Worlds. Now, the most basic level of existence, then, for a civilian on a Chaos-held world is simply that of tribal barbarian, which is what the Sanguinary Worlds are primarily made up of. Heavily militarized barbarians, true, absolutely, but tribal savages in essence, nevertheless, which is why the introduction of the Blood Pact was such a massive revolution to the armies of the Gaur, once he eventually rose to power. But before wandering too far off the point, the base existence is that of a simple tribal civilian, a hunter-gatherer, or maybe in a more settled society that of a farmer, or potentially a raider or a warrior. These people will live relatively normal lives. They won't even understand why the life they live is somehow wrong or terrible, even if they are in direct service to the Chaos Gods. Now, a bit of a subgenre of this might be a world where the population lives in essence, slavery to the Chaos Gods, but they don't know it, as Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh have many sub-deities with which they attempt to trick people into worshipping them, but via a proxy. But again, that's not really a chaos-held world per se, so I'm just mentioning that for argument's sake. But if you've lived your entire life on a world where corn is the dominant religion, you will see nothing wrong with the idea of going raiding every summer, attacking neighboring communities and dragging them back home and sacrificing them on iron altars. That is simply what you have done your whole life. It is simply what you have known and experienced for your whole life. And there will be various local traditions and justifications for this, a la the Vikings, which did it because they were poor and realized that other people in other places had a lot more stuff than them, or arguments over territory, or simply for religious reasons. We happen to worship a god that really likes blood, and so we're going to go over there and hit you over the head with an axe. With slight variations depending upon the god in question. A world that is ruled over by Nurgle, for example, would probably be a swampy, decaying hellhole, where the civilization, what little remains of it, is scattered across the planet so as to avoid spreading the countless poxes that ravage it constantly too quickly to one another. Or potentially they might even worship it and seek out other people in order to bless them. Now, the drawback with this system is, of course, that you're going to run out of people awfully quickly. So it's more likely that it'll be a worship of some specific mutation or ailment as a part of a religious rite, for example. Like eating a mushroom that makes you riotously ill to be given visions by the gods. A world owned by Slaanesh might simply be covered in hedonistic pleasure palaces, where the majority of the population slaves away to feed the excesses of a handful of nobles. Or on a Tzeentchian world, you might have a constant rise and fall of civilization, a constant revolving wheel of various ideologies or political ideas that make sure that no regime survives for too long. But again, from the perspective of a simple civilian, your life here will be relatively normal. There will be religious rites, and you do run the risk of getting sacrificed to one god or another if you end up at the bottom of the totem pole, absolutely. But short, brutal, subservient lives are pretty common in the Imperium, where you'll work away in some field or mine, if you're lucky for yourself as a serf farmer, as there tends to be very little in the way of actual independence on these worlds. See, within the Imperium, you have planets like agricultural worlds where the populace work sort of pseudo-kind of independently of one another, where there are simply just bunches of farms producing materiel that is then bought up by a central guild and shipped into orbit, for example. On other worlds, it might be nightmarish mass mechanized farming, where everyone simply works to be a part of the cog in the machinery. But in the Imperium, there is room for both. On Chaos planets, however, it is nearly always subservience. You are not going to have an idyllic Chaos world, because idyllicism is really not in the ideology here. Because to be exalted in the eyes of the Chaos gods, you must raise yourself up. And you would, of course, desire to be exalted because you are worshipping actual gods that can bless you with stuff. They can give you signs of their favor, which will give you tremendous societal prestige. Even if you are but humble farmers on a world ran by chaos, the humble farmer with a weird glowing insignia carved into his flesh is going to be way, way more popular than any other farmer. And guess how he got that symbol? Well, you see, another farmer, he made a larger pumpkin than him at the last annual Chaos Pumpkin Growing Festival, and so, determined to never be outshone again, he wandered over to his house in the middle of night and beat his wife, children, and the farmer to death with their dog. From that point on, he always had the largest pumpkin. It didn't even matter if there were any larger pumpkins around, as everyone recognized the significance of the brightly glowing brand on his forehead. Now, that's more of a humorous example, but systems like these would inevitably lead to centralization and attempts to exert greater power. You're not going to have independent farmers. You may have serf farmers, where one powerful individual runs dozens of smaller farms, absolutely. This will then probably evolve in conflict with other major farmers, as again, it's all about rising in the eyes of your patron deities. And, a lack of motivation, of ambition, tends to not only not get you very far in a chaos hierarchy, but also tends to make you the person getting hit over the head with your own pet canine. However, this sort of competition also tends to prevent a chaos civilization of this kind to ever really advance over much. Because if you've got everybody competing tooth and nail against one another, you've basically got Orc Society at that point, where you're locked in near endless struggle. And it doesn't matter what you're struggling for, whether it be to have the greatest collection of pustules, or fucking the most slave girls, or again beating the most farmers to death with their own canines, and so on. Your society will nevertheless be rife with constant strife. And so that too will be a pretty frequent part of being a chaos civilian. However, this is still a significantly better existence than the next one, as sometimes, due to the constant strife and conflict and contest, a particularly skilled dog beater will emerge and outshine all the others. Now you've got the beginnings of a larger society that might eventually go planet-wide. Now you've got an example of what happens in, say, the Sabbat worlds, where particular tribes are in control of huge planetary territories, occasionally even multiple worlds, becoming able to venture out beyond the stars to conquer other planets. The life for our example civilian is about to get a lot more restrictive, as whatever theoretical freedom one might have had as serf farmer number 647 on Blood Farm 582 will quickly disappear when you're serf farmer number 567 billion, and you're nothing more than the tiniest imaginable cog in a machine so vast you can't even imagine it. And in return, whoever owns these planets cannot even imagine a cog as small as you either. As whatever tribe you were once a part of is now waging war on a planetary scale. Because again, chaos doesn't back down. The Chaos Gods themselves are creatures of instinct, and will always seek more. Thus they will always drive their servants to seek more. Even if a warlord seizes control over one world, that will never be enough, not in the long term. He will always want to expand and grow more powerful. Thus, he will require more resources. You simply tilling the soil with a hoe and a pitchfork, like in the olden days, no longer suffices. Now, you're going to need to work in the biochemical vats, growing nutrient liquids for billion-man strong armies. And he's also going to get a lot more interested in gaining the attentions of certain powers. And guess how he intends to do that? That's correct. The wholesale sacrifice of truly tremendous numbers of people. Now, hopefully, he's a successful warlord and can get most of these sacrifices from rivaling tribes or the planets he's invading. If not, however, well, the yearly celebration of Khorne's giant penis will have to go on regardless, and you've got to kill at least 1,000 people if you want any hope of Khorne actually noticing. Not to mention as well, I'm sure you are aware of in the olden days, various civilizations had the fascinating habit of murdering various animals to read the future in their entrails. I am happy to inform you that the Chaos Worshippers have much the same ideas, except, they tend to use people instead. And you're lucky if you're in a cornered world and all they do is chop your head off, because believe you me, there are actually worse ways to be sacrificed to the demon gods. This, however, does also open up a lot more possibilities for civilian life, as now we've got to talk about something to do with logistics, my favorite topic. Because a lot of settings that do the whole evil civilization thing often forget about one simple fact. If you do indeed need to carry out enormous gladiatorial contests with vast quantities of human sacrifices in order to keep the sun rising and so on, where are you going to get all of the people from? If you're killing them by the thousands on the daily, as we hear in the description of certain Chaos worlds, well, you're gonna run out of people eventually. And worse still, you're going to run out of a labor pool. As we humans are damnably inconvenient in this regard, as it takes a good 10, 12, 14 years before we grow to a size where we'll really be all that useful as workers. And let's not even get started on the public order problems you might have with stuff like this. Okay, you've lived your entire life for a chaos world. You genuinely do believe that the gods are real and that they're out there and they require sacrifice. Fair enough. That will certainly give you a decent reason to be able to put up with the constant human sacrifices. But at some point, a large group of people are going to go, but why us? Can't it be the people over there? And they're going to decide to start doing something about it. Civilizations based entirely on human sacrifice tend to be rather unstable, due to the innate dissatisfaction that people will have with being fucking killed. Unless the entire population is 1000% indoctrinated, which is theoretically possible on, say, a Slanesh world, for example, with hypnosis or drugs, or on a Nurgle world with various plagues that you can't escape them anyway, so why bother? But it is going to require a fairly stern hand on the rudder to keep the populace quiescent when you're killing them by the thousands every day, especially if you don't get any signs or signifies that it was actually worth it. As an example from our own world would be the Aztecs and how incredibly unpopular they made themselves with everybody else around them. So, in reality, if you want a functional chaos society capable of feeding resources and new conscripts into a war machine large enough to conquer other planets, you are actually going to have a fairly structured society. You are going to have farmers. You are going to have tradesmen, businessmen. You're probably going to have bankers and clerks and various other things as well. You're going to have bureaucrats. Somebody's got to oversee the blood harvests. Somebody's got to manage all of the countless pleasure palaces. Somebody's got to count the poxes, etc. Now, the same rules from the previous society still applies. Everybody is going to be locked in a constant struggle and constant competition. Even the bureaucrats will seek to be the best bureaucrat they can be in the particular way of their ruling god's ideology, whether that be having the largest penile implantment, or again finding out where your competitors live and visiting them late at night. So whilst outwardly a lot of this society is going to resemble a fairly normal human one, it is going to be undercut by just an enormous sense of constant cutthroat competition and outright bloody murder on the frequent, especially as societal taboos will be very, very, very different. If you're on a cornet control planet, then killing your boss and taking his position is probably going to be viewed as totally societally acceptable. You were bigger than him, and he wasn't smart enough to hire any goons to protect him. On a Tzeentchian world, tricking him into dropping a toaster into his bathtub would be another way, or on a Nurgle world, to simply be able to sustain more poxers than him, and so on and so on and so on. But there are going to be a lot of civilian jobs. This is also a massive pet peeve I have with several grimdark universes, Trench Crusade in particular, where they say that entire regions are just outright ruled by hell. Actual demonic forces that are particular positions of status for people who kill themselves, that are squares where people commit ritual suicide by the thousands every day on the off chance that maybe they'll become an unholy chorister or something, where people have flesh markets where they sell human meat by the pound, etc. And all of that sounds dreadful, I agree. It's got a good flavor to it, but where's all of this human meat coming from? How are you not absolutely decimating your own population? Who's providing the food for the frontline troops? Who's working in the factories if the factories themselves eat people? Or to put it more bluntly and poetically, as cool as it sounds to quench every blade in blood, if you do that, you're going to run out of blood long before you run out of iron. But that doesn't mean there aren't worlds like that out there. So now we've talked about the life of a fairly average person on a fairly average chaos-held world, which will have to, by simple necessity of maintaining an army and a warlord that wants to expand, it'll need to be to some degree relatively normal, blood orgies and sacrifices aside. You are going to make certain concessions to keep the populace relatively quiet. There are other worlds. Imagine, for example, a chaos world where demons walk openly, somewhere where the veil is thin, or where major cults have made their abodes, or even chaos space marine formations and chapters, or that you are on the capital world of an enormously powerful warlord. These worlds do not exist as self-contained ecosystems, or in order to support a greater war effort elsewhere. They exist to fulfill specific roles that only Chaos worlds have. Ritual significance, the worship of the dark gods, or pursuing their designs in ways that would be utterly self-destructive for any other human population. You can, for example, have a Chaos Forge world, where they literally do just work people until they die, where they sacrifice them by the thousands because specific demon alloys require human blood, or the extraction of souls to be bound into special artillery shells, etc., etc. In these cases, the best case scenario is that you are a worker there, and you will live, probably, a short, undervalued, and painful life as you slave away at some infernal machine, feeding skulls into a furnace or something. You'll be beaten to death by an overlord soon enough, and if you're lucky enough to become an overlord because of your continued abuse of other fellow slaves, your life might be a little bit longer, until another overlord pushes you into a molten vat of boiling blood. As the constant competition remains, but these worlds can be fed from outside worlds. Basically, if you have a world that has literal flesh factories, where they rip human beings apart and render them down to components for prosthetics, for example, as we know, Chaos have far better bioengineering tech than the Imperium. So if a blood-packed soldier, for example, in the Sabbath World's Crusade lost a hand, well, they'd chop off somebody else's hand and sew it on, or transplant skin or organs, etc. Not to mention all of the myriad uses for human body parts one can find in rituals or to appease and bribe demons. But if you're going to have the flesh farms, you're going to have another planet somewhere else producing the humans. You could, for example, have the agricultural world, where whenever a human reaches a certain age, say 30, for example, they get shipped off to the flesh farms. You can still keep a healthy populace on agri-worlds, which will outnumber the flesh farms by a significant margin, while still having the horrible nonsense. And of course, there's going to be a myriad different worlds like these. Some are going to be designing weapons of war. Others are going to have tremendous religious significance. The Imperium has an equivalent in this in shrine worlds. Planets where particularly great miracles occurred, or where, manifestations of the God Emperor's will happened. Chaos is going to have the same. Worlds of particular religious significance, the coming of a great warlord, or the ascent of a fighter to demon prince status, things like that. These will be worlds of worship, where countless rituals, often also requiring lots of human sacrifice, will be carried out. On planets like these, if you're very, very lucky, you'll be one of the privileged nobility, those carrying out the rituals, or at the very least, counting and keeping the books for all of the slaves' transports, comings and goings. If you are a slave, the best you can hope for is, again, a short and brutal life, before being murdered in a senseless and probably awkward way. And if by some miracle you manage to escape the central hubs of civilization, quote-unquote, the main temples, you'll be living in the wilds, being hunted like an animal by, again, if you're lucky, humans. If not, well, let's just say that some really, really unfortunate shit tends to roam the hinterlands of these planets. And, believe it or not, it does actually also get even worse. Because at least if you're on one of these worlds and you are a Chaos citizen, as little protection the past grants you, there is at the very least the possibility, the potential for improving your lot in life via ruthless competition. Chaos, for all of its many flaws, has a fairly fluid social hierarchy. If in an imperial world you grabbed an overlord's whip, pulled him down, choked him with it, they'd execute you because that's a crime. You can't do that, slave, bad person. If you do that on a chaos world, well, you're clearly stronger than the Overlord. Are they going to apply the law against you? Well, they might. There might be actually a fixed social hierarchy on some worlds where the tribe, or the original people, have absolute authority over the slaves, sure. But at least there's a possibility, a hope, to rise up, even if the percentage chance is going to be absolutely minuscule. No. The worst fate is if you live on a world conquered by chaos, and you have been forcefully introduced to chaos civilization. Now, you are the lowest of the low. Worse, you are an anathema. You are not somebody who understands the universal truth of chaos. You are a blind, corpse-worshipping fanatic. And even if you try to integrate and kiss up to your new rulers, as many do, and again, that's often the best way to survive, joining the occupation rather than resisting it, you will, at absolute best, receive a favored servant status. The best you can hope for is being a slave that's fed on time, and maybe with the ability to bully fellow slaves. Though even that is not necessarily an escape. Some worlds are going to be outright conquered and then colonized by chaos, in which case they too will need a slave population to keep the wheels of industry running. That slave population will obviously come from the local populace. You will be a serf and you will die a serf. But at least you'll live for a while. Or you may be on a planet that is set for exploitation. Chaos has many queer, warp-based ways of looting a planet's resources outright. We see examples of this in the Sabbath Worlds series, with creatures capable of draining entire oceans dry, teleporting the water through the warp to other Chaos-held worlds, as again, Chaos plants need an economy. They need water, they need crops to keep functioning. But your world isn't a proper Chaos world now, is it? Or giant beasts that devour entire mountains, spitting out their resources to be transported off-world. Or simply just, raided the good old-fashioned way, moved up into orbit and then dispatched to wherever needs it. These planets' populations are not sacred. They will be worked until they die because they are unholy. They are anathema to Chaos's cause. They are not worthy of preservation, and they will serve a far higher purpose as slaves and as sacrifices than they ever could as a labor pool. Best case scenario for the planet is that eventually the labor pool, once exhausted, will be replenished by outworld slaves, and the planet might then eventually also become a proper occupied Chaos world, but for the original populace, you're just dead. You're either worked to death, or sacrificed, or fed into a machine somewhere, or used as spare parts. Life on such a Chaos world, in such a role, will be excessively cruel and mercifully short. Things that in and of themselves can also be recruitment mechanisms, as it is also important to remember that a great deal of Chaos's troops actually do come from Imperial worlds, as we address the final kind of regular life in Chaos society, that of a cultist. You know, the guys being herded in front of the Chaos Space Marines to absorb fire. Those guys. These are, of course, the rough equivalent of a kind of fanatic zealot priest, perhaps. Or, in reality, it's something more organic, really. Akin to people who get crazed religious ideas of going out and fighting for their Lord and Savior. Something deeply spiritual, and in the case of Chaos, of course, as well, very corrupting. It is not necessarily a natural zeal. It might simply be an effect of being in a Chaos-controlled world, becoming affected by its ever-sneaking corruption. It might also be a simple survival mechanism. If you're being herded off to be brutally murdered in slaughter pits somewhere, maybe you try to adopt your captor's ideology, their behavior, their religion, in order to not be tossed into the meat pits. We humans are remarkably adaptive creatures when we want to be. And there are several cases in our own history as well of individuals deciding to take up their conqueror's ideology, beliefs, and faith, rather than suffer eternally underneath their yoke. These conscripts are, well, little better than slaves, really. The majority of them will also die after short and brutal lives, little better than the slaves from which they may have come. Some will be boarded aboard spaceships and used to operate the arcane machinery for the rest of their lives. At least that can bring a degree of safety deep beneath the deck, far away from crazed priests and roaming Chaos Space Marines, whereas yet others will simply be used as expendable cannon fodder and herded into battle. Maybe if by some absolute miracle you survive enough of them, there might again be an opportunity to rise through the ranks, but unlikely, extraordinarily unlikely. And there you have it. Life under Chaos control. Some of it can be all right, at the very least insofar as that you are ignorant of a better world, but a lot of it is only going to be good for the rich and the powerful. And almost no matter where you are in the 41st millennium, to be fair, that holds true, as the poor and downtrodden people operating the grand machinery of empires so vast they cannot even comprehend them are rarely particularly happy or fulfilled. At least in the Imperium, there are relatively small chances of you being tossed on an altar and having your guts ripped out, however, whereas that is a fairly ever-present concern in Chaos society. And the larger a group you belong to, the less your worth is. Unless you are one of those handful who somehow manage to claw their way up, even in a society as brutal, violent, and unendingly chaotic as those ruled over by the servants of the dark gods. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.